This is Reading Explained, where each week I give you context to better understand the readings that you hear at Mass on Sunday. This Sunday celebrates the Holy Family of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and your parish has the option to choose between two different reading sets. The first set of readings are both about the story of Abraham and Sarah and their faithfulness to the Lord. The second set of readings are both about interpersonal relationships. Your parish can choose which set of readings they want to use. Regardless of which you hear on Sunday, I want to highlight something that comes in the second reading of the second set that is important to all of us females specifically. The second reading of the second set comes from the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians. And there's a line in there that without context can land incorrectly and might raise questions for you. I want to address it and give you the explanation because it's not what you think. In that second reading that you might hear, you will hear, "Wives, be subordinate to your husbands, as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them." Now, I understand how that might sound on the surface like God is saying husbands should be superior to their wives. But that is not at all what it's saying. In fact, we know that, and we know that because of who authored this. This was a letter that St. Paul wrote to the Colossians. St. Paul wrote many letters to many different groups of people that he was teaching the gospel to. He wrote letters to the Thessalonians, to the Philippians, to the Corinthians, to the Galatians, to the Ephesians. So in all of his letters, his teachings are the same. They don't vary depending on who the audience is. His teachings are unified and universal across the spectrum of his letters. The only difference is that in this excerpt from this letter, you're not getting his expansion or his explanation of what he means when he says that. But we know what he means because in his letter to the Ephesians, he breaks it down. He is talking about the Christian household and the dynamic between wives and husbands, and he says, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." Not just wives be subject to your husbands and husbands do whatever you want, just love the wife. That's not what he's saying. He says, be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, be subject to your husband as you are to the Lord. And then he goes on to say, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church. But what does that mean? How did Christ love the church? He goes on to say, he died for her. Christ gave himself up for the church so that the church could be better, that the church could be without blemish or without spot or without wrinkle, and the church could be more holy. He goes on to say how husbands, when they marry their wives, they entirely separate themselves from their parents and from lives as they knew it, their whole existence prior to her, because when they get married, they are joining together with their wife and becoming one flesh. So he explains here quite literally that you cannot be superior to your own body. He says that in the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. You can't be inferior to part of yourself. You can't be superior to part of yourself. You are one. You are whole. So he also goes on to say, just because you're subjecting yourself to somebody, by the way, does not mean that you're declaring that they are superior to you. So that's important to note also. But this section from his letter to the Ephesians is really famous because it's used to study what's called the theology of the body. In it, he expresses that Christ is like the head of the body. The church is like the body of the body. And even though the head might be physically above the body and they have different roles, they can't exist without each other. They rely on each other. And so it creates what he calls is a mysterious equality between them. And he goes on to express that he's making an analogy of that, the theology of the body, to husbands and wives. Husbands may be like the head, the wives may be like the body, but again, they can't exist without each other. They are one flesh, and there's a mysterious equality between the two of them. So when you hear, wives, be subordinate to your husbands as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives. Husbands, you might have a slightly different role than the wife. Yeah, the wives are going to subject themselves to the husband. That doesn't mean that he's superior to her, but he's going to love her enough to give up his entire world before her and become one flesh with her. He is in no way superior to her. That's not what this means. Now, also, I know the word subordinate can be a little jarring. Keep in mind that this was translated out of Greek. The word for subordinate can also mean like dependent and things like that too. So keep in mind, it falls right in line with his other teachings and his other letters. You just don't get the explanation in this reading on Sunday. That's it. But I assure you, it's actually really beautiful. So with that explanation, here's what the reading says in its entirety. It's actually a really beautiful reading. People sometimes use it in weddings. A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Colossians. Brothers and sisters, put on, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, heartfelt compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving one another if one has a grievance against another. As the Lord has forgiven you, so must you also do. And over all these things, put on love. That is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of Christ control your hearts, the peace into which you were also called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, as in all wisdom you teach and admonish one another, singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. And whatever you do, in word or in deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Wives, be subordinate to your husbands, as is proper in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and avoid any bitterness toward them. Children, obey your parents in everything, for this is pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, so they may not become discouraged. The word of the Lord. So hopefully that explanation helps you to better understand not only this reading, but the concept of wives and husbands and that dynamic. If so, please send this video to someone who may also find it to be helpful, and come back next week as I break down another reading for you. I will see you then.